In 29 days, voters will have their say on the closest and most unpredictable election in a generation. An election where Scotland takes centre stage, where the stakes couldn't be higher. Welcome to the Leaders' Debate. Good evening from Elphinstone Hall at the University of Aberdeen. This is where nervous students trek in every year to sit their exams. Under examination tonight, we have Jim Murphy, leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Nicola Sturgeon of the Scottish National Party, Willie Rennie from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Ruth Davidson for the Scottish Conservatives, David Coburn, who's from the UK Independence Party, and Patrick Harvey, representing the Scottish Greens. And of course, please do get involved tonight. You can visit our live page on the BBC Scotland news website, or you can go on Twitter, where our hashtag is Leaders Debate. And the first question tonight comes from Gillian Van Teberen. Gillian.
Evening. Is it responsible to spend our way out of debt?
Is it responsible to spend our way out of debt? Jim Murphy.
I think there's a better way of running our economy. There's a fairer way of doing it. I think we've had 5 years where the Conservative government will no doubt celebrate what it thinks is a job well done, while so many Scottish families are so much worse off. It's time to end this failed austerity experiment. And the way of doing that isn't just by talking about cuts. It's about making sure working families are better off. So we'll increase the minimum wage. We'll also abolish these exploitative 0 hours contracts, because Scotland succeeds when working families succeed. And so many working families all across Scotland are hurting so much because of what the Conservative and Liberal Democrat government have done. We'll take a different approach and we'll end that crushing Tory austerity.
Just to be clear, when you say you will end the austerity, does that mean that there will be spending rises under a Labour government? I thought you were going to bring down spending.
We're clear. There are taxes that we will increase.
No, not taxes, spending.
Well, we've set out our plans as to what we will save and what we would cut, but they are very targeted. What we would do, for example, is on child benefit. We would limit the increases in child benefit for 2 years in the next Parliament. But there's a different way of doing this. You don't have to just cut your way out of austerity. We can grow and invest in our people, because if people are earning more, they're working more regular hours, they can pay taxes, they don't have to rely on welfare. And that's a successful and Labour way out of austerity, and it's a world of a difference from what we've got at the moment.
Nicola Sturgeon, is it responsible to spend our way out of debt? That's what you want to do, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it's responsible to carry on what has been done for the past 5 years. Cutting our way out of debt has been holding back the growth in our economy, it's been undermining our public services, and it's been driving people into poverty. The cuts that we've seen in the last 5 years have hit the 10% poorest in our community more than any other group. I don't think that's responsible. I don't think it's responsible to carry on with an austerity programme when the experts say it's going to drive an additional 1 million children into poverty by the end of this decade. Now, the Tories, Labour and the Liberals all say there should be more spending cuts in the next Parliament, and I'm glad that Jim Murphy, on the part of Labour, has finally admitted that his party is proposing spending cuts. I take a different view. I think there should be modest spending increases over the next Parliament of about 0.5% in real terms. That would allow the debt and the deficit to continue to fall. It would take slightly longer to completely eliminate the deficit, but it would allow us to spend money investing in infrastructure and innovation and the things that get our economy growing. It would allow us to invest more in vital public services like the NHS. And it would allow us to lift people out of poverty. No, the 0.5% I'm proposing is in real terms, so it's above inflation. It's a modest, responsible, fiscally responsible approach, but it means that we no longer have to watch the poorest in our society get poorer. The final point I would make about what's happened over the past 5 years is that the austerity programme hasn't worked even on its own terms. George Osborne has actually missed all of his own fiscal targets. He's missed his borrowing targets by £150 billion. So I think it's time for an alternative, and that is why the SNP is arguing that alternative in this election.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, I don't think it's responsible to pass our debts on to our children. That's why we're trying to clear up the mess that we were left by the previous Labour government. But I want to pick Nicola up on one of the points that she made. She said, and I wrote it down, the austerity is holding back the growth in our economy. We are the fastest growing major economy anywhere in the world. That is an indisputable fact. We have also brought down child poverty in this country by the Scottish Government's own figures. Pensioner poverty is at its lowest level. But what I'd like to show people out there is not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it. Because right now, today, we spend 3 times the amount of money on servicing our debt interest as a country than we spend on the entire health budget of Scotland every year. And if we don't bring down our debts, it's like a credit card. You know if you don't make your minimum payments, that just goes up and up and up. And it is not responsible, and it is not fair to land our children with those debts.
OK, please put your hands up if you want to contribute, and we'll come to you in a moment. But for now, Willie Reddy.
What we've just heard is that 3 parties want to divert away from the plan that's already working. We've got the highest growth rates in the Western world. We've got unemployment way down. We've got employment way up, 174,000 extra in Scotland as a result. The economic plan is working, we should stick with it. Rather than doing what the Labour Party and the SNP want to do, which is to borrow far too much. Their answer to record levels of debt is even more debt. That's astonishing. And with the Tories, they want to balance the books on the back of the poor. I think that is unacceptable, and that's what this government has prevented. I think we should stay the course, prevent the seesaw economics of the past that has damaged this country, because I think then we can continue to get the economy on track and do it fairly.
You're in favour of continued austerity? I'm
in favour of balancing the books. I'm in favour of doing it fairly. I'm in favour of keeping the economy growing, because that has resulted in improving living standards for people in this country. That's the approach we should stick with, because that's the approach we've adopted in the last 5 years.
David Coburn.
Well, Edinburgh was known as the Athens of the North for its classical Greek architecture. Now it's known as the Athens of the North for the SNP's modern Greek economics. And quite frankly, when I hear what Ms Sturgeon has to say about this, it's terrifying, the lack of understanding of simple economics. You cannot keep on spending money you do not have, and the bigger the debt you build, you're just going to build an even bigger debt. She seems to have no simple way of paying it. The only people who can create jobs are businesses. Governments don't create jobs, businesses do. We have to get the economy going, and we have to take the poorest people in society out of taxation. So UKIP wants to raise the taxation to 13,000 and take out the lowest people in society out of that, and that's the best way to get the economy moving. We also have to talk about enterprise. We talk about benefits all the time, or at least these people do, but nobody talks about enterprise. We must take the shackles off people, get ourselves out of the European Union, which has so many rules and regulations against business, and let's get the economy moving. That's the best way of getting people out of poverty.
And you want, Mr Coburn, am I right in saying, you want to save up to £8 billion a year from subsidies currently paid from Westminster to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
Well, what we'd like to see is we have a new system now, because now the Barnett formula is finished, according to the leader of the SNP, Mr Salmond. We have to have a new way of doing it. Well, Scotland must raise its own money through its own parliament. We have to look into this. We have to change the way it's done. But we have not said we're getting rid of the Barnett formula, but Salmond already has said it's going. So there we are.
OK, thank you.
At least we're realistic about it.
Thank you. Patrick Harvey.
Well, I think the many thousands of people who are working hard, delivering public services that we all, each and every one of us, depend on every day of our lives, will feel offended at the idea that it's only businesses that create jobs. It's a question of the quality of our spending. If we're spending money on something socially destructive, which makes the world a less safe place, such as weapons of mass destruction, we may come on to debate that later. If we're spending money on things which are keeping us dependent on an economic model which has already failed us, which drove inequality in our society and around the world, then we're spending on the wrong things. If we're creating jobs which are 0-hours contracts and low paid and leaving people vulnerable and unable to make their own way in the world because of that stressful situation that they've been left in, then we're getting it wrong. We should be investing instead in the things which build social capital, investing in the future industries which will replace the outgoing fossil fuel economy, for example, which this part of the country is so precariously dependent on still. Investing in the things which will build a stronger, better future. That's the kind of spending that we should be doing more than ever at this difficult time. The kind of spending that I'm afraid we've seen is digging us deeper into a hole and is allowing many, many people to fall through the holes of an economic system which have already failed us. Okay. We need a change of direction, and it's not just about obsessing over how much spending versus how much debt.
Thank you very much. Let's take some points. Yes, the man at the front.
Yeah, it's a question, Mr Coburn. He's actually very specifically said that UKIP's policy is not to get rid of the Barnett formula. Nigel Farage, at a rally that I watched on the BBC today from Grimsby, actually said it was UKIP's policy to get rid of the Barnett formula. Who's telling the truth?
Mr Coburn?
Well, as I said before, the Barnett formula is finished. We know that. What he's saying is that the long term, it's going. We don't say when. We're going to gradually wean Scotland off the Barnett formula, and let's raise our own taxation.
Yes,
he actually said it was a UKIP's policy, look, if they're in a position, that they will get rid of it now.
I think if
we are, but it's not instantaneously, obviously. We've still got to win the election. Okay.
I think if we try to spend too much time tonight,
not all at the same time. Thank you. Ms Sturgeon, first of all, then Mr Murphy. Thank you.
I think if we spend too much time tonight trying to find coherence and consistency in UKIP's arguments, we won't get anywhere at all. So, can I go back to the substance of the question, though? It's not a question of whether we need to get debt and deficit down. Of course we do. It's a question of the way in which we do that and the speed at which we do that. Ruth said earlier on that child poverty was falling. Child poverty in Scotland and across the UK is rising again. 100,000 more children are estimated to be in poverty by the end of this decade. I don't think that is fair to the next generation. Now, Ruth is standing on a platform of an additional £30 billion of cuts. £12 billion of that is to come from social security. But the Tories don't say where the axe is going to fall. We had a leaked document last week that said it might be taxing disability benefits, removing carers' allowance and taking away child benefits. So if those are not the policies, I want to ask Ruth a direct question tonight. Where is the axe falling to find that £12 billion? Because there's one thing you can know for sure, it will be on the poorest and most vulnerable in our society, and that is not acceptable.
I said I would come to Jim Murphy, but let's get a direct answer to that first of all. So £12 billion of savings from the welfare budget. Where precisely, Ms Davidson, will they come from?
Well, we've said that £12 billion are part of a further package of cuts worth £30 billion. And they're a package of cuts signed up to by the Liberal Democrats, signed up by the Labour Party as well. And we've broken those figures down. We've said £13 billion will come from departmental spending. So that's carrying on the work that we've done to cut the cost of government at Whitehall departments, etc. £5 billion will be from aggressively going after tax avoiders and tax evaders, because we've worked hard. We thought they got too much of an easy ride under Labour. We've passed 40 laws to try and crack down on companies that aren't paying their way.
Where will these cuts come from?
And on the £12 billion, what we've said is we're going to freeze benefits for 2 years. We've also said that, for example, we're going to cut the benefits cap. So instead of being £26,000, it's going to be £23,000. And we're also looking to cut the amount of out-of-work benefits that we spend, because we want to cut the number of people out of work.
And we've had some success with that. How many children will be pushed deeper into poverty because of the freeze on welfare payments? Have you even calculated that?
Working tax credits.
What we have said is that... It's very strange, because Nicola is standing here, but your minister stood up in the Scottish Parliament and patted themselves on the back for Scottish child poverty having fallen, and it has. And we also have cut. No, you had your chance. We also have cut pensioner poverty to its lowest ever level. We had the biggest single rise in the state pension. Your party raised the state pension by 10 pence. We raised it by more than 5 pence.
We've been in fairness, Mr. Thank you, First Minister. Mr. Murphy, to be fair, has been waiting a very long time to come in.
first of all, it's so long ago that I wanted to come in. It was in response to something that David said. And just to say to us this evening, we've got about 40 minutes left in this programme. And it would be a waste of a debate about the future of Scotland if we allowed a conversation about UKIP to dominate the next 40 minutes, because Scotland's much more important than a conversation about UKIP. And I listen to Ruth and Nicola. Ruth will give us more cuts and Nicola will give us more borrowing. I just want to be open with you, is that Labour is going to ask those people who earn the most to pay a little more. You can't have social justice on the cheap. And this isn't conventional politics, because politicians who go into elections saying, we'll put some taxes up, usually lose elections. But we just want to be honest. You cannot fund the NHS and you cannot fund the education system on the current levels of taxation. So we don't want to tax working people, we don't want to tax the middle classes. But if you do earn over £150,000, congratulations, as I've said before, but we are going to put your taxes up. And I think most people in Scotland would accept that.
Thank you very much. The person who's been waiting the longest now is, thank you, Ms Davidson. Willie Rennie.
What I find very unacceptable is that Ruth Davidson wants to cut £30 billion from public spending, but she is not proposing one new tax on wealthy people. Now, we want to increase tax, corporation tax on the banks. We want to have a mansion tax to try and deal with the deficit. She's rejected those plans. She wants to balance the books on the back of the poor, and I think that is unacceptable.
I'd like to hear from the
tax
briefly, and then we'll go to
Fair to say, the interesting thing here is about how much money is brought into the Exchequer. The richest 1% already currently pay 25%, and it's rising to 27%, which is higher than in any year under Labour. We're also taking in more money under the higher tax rate, the 45p tax rate, than in any year under Labour. And the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, has said that Jim's tax raise that he's talking about here will bring in between £0 and £2 billion. Zero. They're non-dom crackdown that they talked about today. It's going to cost Britain money. Ed Balls says that tax increase that they brought in here is going to cost Britain money.
You can't keep speaking to the end of the programme, Ruth.
Ruth Davidson, thank you. Raise your point. You can have a very brief response if you will. I really want to hear. You can, sir, in a moment. I really want to hear from the audience after Mr Murphy.
In this election, you've really got a choice. It's a Tory party that's going to defend kind of refusal to tax millionaires more, and this is a Labour party that's going to act on zero-hours contracts.
Thank you.
We will end those exploitative zero-hours contracts.
Thank you, Mr Murphy. Let's go up to the back, and the woman with her hand up and the scarf on at the back. Yes, madam.
At the moment, in fact, it seems that the Tories want to get into people with a knife and do the cutting with a knife, where the Labour Party seem to want to do it with a smile. I want to know what the Labour Party are going to do in terms of much cuts are going to make to the welfare budget.
OK, well, we'll take a few more points and we'll hear from the man with the glasses and the blue shirt here. Yes.
I think instead of all your bickering, you could maybe look at a history book and do a lot better to see things like the Marshall Plan and the New Deal and see the kind of spending that can create jobs and create prosperity, and the entire country could do much better. It doesn't have to be all cuts. You can spend and do far better than we're doing right now.
OK, thank you. And the woman in black on the end, yes.
I think Aberdeen's a really good example of why austerity isn't working. We boast one of the lowest unemployment rates in the UK, and yet 2 weeks ago the Instant Neighbour Food Bank had to put out a city-wide appeal for food. I'm sorry, Willie and Ruth, the plan is not working.
Thank you very much. David Coburn.
Well, all the parties here, the one thing, the difference between us and them, is that we believe in getting out of the European Union. We spend an enormous amount of money, wasting a lot of money in the European Union. If we bring that back, we could put £3 billion into the health service. We could, the 8 billion, out of the 8 billion we saved, and quite frankly, that's a very good way of stopping.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick.
That is the thing we should do, and we should stop squandering money on foreign aid, which mostly goes to a lot of dictators. It's very important.
I am proud that the coalition government has met its foreign aid target.
We have poor people here.
Thank you, Patrick Harvey.
James, I think what we've all heard and what I think the audience has reacted to with some degree of revulsion is the idea that we save money by cancelling our membership of the civilised world. I think most of us would want to reject that. We would want to Reject that, absolutely. But I just wanted to respond to what Jim was saying about taxation levels, because it's good to hear some people starting to talk about getting back to a more progressive taxation system. We have a very unfair tax system at the moment. But let's face it, every one of us standing here on this panel is on a very high-paid job, a very generous salary as politicians. Every one of us could afford to pay more tax, not just a tiny number who earn £150,000, but people like us on high salaries that are below that threshold. So I think everyone who cares about investment in public services needs to be willing to say, you're right, we can't have Scandinavian public services and American levels of tax. I'd like to see a Scandinavian approach to both.
And I'd like to take another question, which comes from Jeremy Fernandez. Mr Fernandez, your question, please.
Scotland won't be able to live off oil and gas forever. What measures will you implement to help the transition?
Thank you very much. Scotland won't be able to live off oil and gas forever. What measures would you implement to help the transition? A good question here in Aberdeen, and we had a lot of interest, of course, from this audience in questions about oil and gas. Nicola Sturgeon.
Let me say two things. Firstly, in an energy sense, we've got to continue to work to make the transition to renewable sources of energy. We had statistics published just a couple of weeks ago that showed that we are now generating something like half of our energy consumption from renewable sources. So really good progress, but we've got work still there to do. But I want to give you this statistic because the second thing we've got to do is make sure we're taking the steps and investing in areas, it goes back in some ways to the previous question, that grow the non-oil parts of our economy. You know, if you look over at the years to the end of this decade, oil revenues are predicted by 2020 to be £3 billion lower than they are just now if the oil price stays at the level it's at just now. But by 2020, our non-oil revenues, our onshore revenues, are predicted to be £15 billion higher than they are today. So we need to invest in the areas that grow the non-oil parts of our economy. That's what we're seeking to do as the Scottish Government, but it's one of the many reasons why lifting austerity, and as the gentleman in the audience says, freeing up resources to invest in the kinds of things that create jobs and get our economy growing. That's what we need to do.
Just to be clear, did you say 2020?
By the end of the decade.
Yeah. So, just to be clear then, I mean, you want Scotland to have control over all taxation, which the figures suggest, you could argue at the moment, Scotland couldn't really afford. Are you saying you want that in 2020, or after that, or now, or when?
I don't think it's any secret that I want Scotland to have as many powers over our own economy and our own fiscal decisions
do you want this?
as soon as possible.
Well, when is that?
As Scotland's voice in the next House of Commons, if the SNP is there in numbers, we'll be arguing for as many powers to come to Scotland as quickly as possible.
Just on the specific point of what you call full fiscal autonomy, when do you want that to come in?
Quickly as the other parties agree to give it. You'd probably better ask them when they're going to support it.
Would your MPs vote for it next year?
Yes, I would vote for
full fiscal autonomy?
I would vote for it. Would you support it?
No, I wouldn't.
Let's have
Absolutely not.
I want very quickly to explain what it is. I want to explain what it is. I think it's important, Mr Murphy, hang on, because I think we need to explain, just to be totally clear, full fiscal autonomy, as I understand it, which is being advanced here, is the idea that Scotland has complete control of taxation and spending, and not everything short of defence and foreign affairs. It's such a horrible jargon phrase that I thought we should maybe stick to that.
If you look at the BBC poll today, it's actually an option in Scotland that's rather popular. People want more power in Scotland.
Let's ask Jim Murphy about it then.
This is the idea that we cut ourselves off from sources of taxation all across the UK. Now, after the difficult time Aberdeen and the north east of Scotland's been through, the idea that we voluntarily give up on the pooling and sharing of resources, the ability to transfer money around these islands, no longer have that basis of supporting the UK state pension and other matters such as that, I don't think it makes sense. I think staying part of the electoral system... There's just one example I'll use to illustrate. Labour's in favour of introducing a mansion tax on properties over £2 million across the UK. To pay, first instalment to pay for 1,000 more NHS nurses in Scotland. Just 1/3 of 1% of that money will be raised in Scotland. But we will get access to tens of millions of pounds of that money because it comes from London and the south east of England. Why would you voluntarily go for this nice-sounding phrase
Jim,
that would be so
reality.
damaging to Scotland and Scotland's economy.
Okay, I want to get around this panel. No, I'm so sorry, but there's 6 people on the panel. There's 6 people on the panel, and I want to get around them. So let's go around on this point. Ruth Davidson, first of all. And the question was, remember, oil and gas. How will you smooth the transition as it gradually runs out?
Well, we've just given the biggest package to the oil and gas sector. We heard what they were asking for, and £1.3 billion in the last budget to make sure that we help them at this time because they need it. But during the referendum, I challenged Nicola on our £113 $1 per barrel figure on oil and how oil was going to pay for everything. And she told me that I was doing Scotland down by suggesting that that might not always be the case and that I was being pessimistic. But for me, it's actually not about the pounds and the pence. I've got an even more broad view than Jim on this, and that's the United Kingdom is one country, and we voted to stay in it. And as part of that, that means that we are a social union as well as a political union. So yes, I want everybody, whether they're in England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, to pay into the same pot. And I want a pensioner in Kirkcaldy to get the same state pension as the pensioner in Cardiff, because that's what we voted for.
Okay.
And that's the country that I want to live in.
Thank you very much. We'll go around the panel. Willie Rennie.
Thank goodness this is just an academic discussion. Just imagine if we had a different vote last September. I think it would be rather more heated. I think there would be blind panic as a result of what's happened in the North Sea. To have our economy, not wholly, but largely dependent on the volatile, falling resource of the North Sea, I think would have caused absolute chaos to our public services, to our pensions, to our teachers, to our hospitals. And Nicola Sturgeon has got the nerve to continue to argue for the policy that was soundly trounced in last year's referendum. I find that
galling. If I could deal with the question of oil as a fossil fuel, because that's what it is, our dependence, our over-dependence on fossil fuel in the age of climate change. The world has, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 4 and 6 times as much fossil fuel as we can afford to burn if we're serious, not about handing on a strong economy, but handing on a livable world to the next generation. So the urgency of that transition really can't be overstated. And my big problem with this whole debate for years, not just during the referendum campaign and since then, has been that I hear other parties vociferously disagreeing about the fact that they support basically the same policy, which is maximum extraction. That's the policy that they all share. What we need to do is maximise revenue in the short term and minimise extraction in the long term.
What will happen to all the jobs here? Mr. Harvey.
We've said very clearly we support a city deal for this region, but it has to be one based on the word you used in the question, transition. It has to be about identifying the skills and the kind of supply chain businesses which are not only relevant today, but which will remain relevant in the area of marine technology and the renewable industries that we're going to see rising. If instead,
140,000.
Ruth, one point, just 1 point. If instead we do what you've suggested and we give tax breaks to the industry for future exploration for reserves that we cannot afford to burn, then we simply dig ourselves deeper into a hole and we will lurch from crisis to crisis to crisis. And one day, the next oil crisis will be the last oil crisis, and we will regret not having acted sooner.
You can come back in a minute, but we haven't heard from Mr. Coburn yet, and I imagine, I'm very sure that our audience have things to say about oil and gas, so put your hands up if you do. We'll go to David Coburn first of all, and then Nicola Sturgeon, and then we'll come out for some points. Mr. Coburn.
Well, as Mr. Rennie said, if we'd listened to the SNP, we'd have been calling in the IMF by now because the oil price has halved. And the good thing about being part of the UK is we can spread the risk right across the UK. So there are some companies who benefit in other parts of the UK from a lower oil price, and that can be used to help support Aberdeen and places that are having trouble at the moment.
Question was about
we cannot have that
Mr.
if we are not part of the UK. And if we'd listened to Ms Sturgeon and her crew, quite frankly, we would be bankrupt, we would have nothing, the country would be finished. So
the question was
they
about
have
the
no idea about economics.
The question was about the transition.
Transition, we must get support for that, and because we're part of the greater United Kingdom. That will enable Aberdeen to survive. If we listen to the nonsense of the SNP, we would be bust and Aberdeen would be too. So they don't know what they're talking about.
Three quick points. Firstly, the Scottish economy is not dependent on oil. Our economic output without oil is the same as the UK's. Second point, there is no oil-producing country in the world that's looking at a lower oil price and saying, oh my goodness, we're no longer capable of running our own economies. You look at Norway, for example. Norway's sitting on an oil fund worth £500 billion because they stewarded their oil resource properly and didn't allow it to be squandered the way ours has. And thirdly and lastly, if you listen to these other parties here, then you get the impression that they think Westminster is some great protection for Scotland's public finances. The cumulative cut to Scotland's public finances over the past few years has been £12 billion.
You want to do 40?
That's the price to Scotland of austerity. So this is a clear choice. This is about taking responsibility for how we manage our own resources or leaving ourselves at the mercy of continued Westminster cuts. I think taking control ourselves is a much better option.
I think we should ask the people who I imagine know quite a lot, I will come to you, who know quite a lot about oil and gas, and I imagine they are among us here. The woman with blonde hair and the white wristband. Yes, just there.
You said that you wanted to spread the risk over the rest of the UK, but why wouldn't that be the same for spreading the risk over the rest of Europe?
Thank you. And right up, we may come to that, right up the back. Thank you, right up the back.
Nicola made the point about putting in new funding to combat potential losses in oil and gas. But why has the Scottish Government strangled funding for the North East of Scotland over the last Parliament? We have nothing else, and they have done nothing to combat it. Another point I have is Nicola says she speaks for Scotland. She doesn't speak for everyone. We've got 5 political parties that we respect. Everyone has their own political views. Scotland does not have a unique political ideology different from the rest of the UK. That became apparent when we unfortunately voted in a UKIP MEP.
Thank you. Let's go down to the front.
We're in Aberdeen University, which is a research university, and it's one of the most of the Scottish research universities that has a cut in funding from the Scottish Government. Is that going to be reversed? Because Aberdeen needs that research funding to compensate for the fall in oil price.
I'll take one more question and then we'll come back down here. So, yes, in the hat, yes.
We all recognise that we need to move away from fossil fuels. So will the Scottish Government completely ban fracking then, so it doesn't occur in Scotland?
OK, thank you very much. Jim Murphy.
Well, I would approach on fracking that says local communities should decide. There should be no fracking in a community unless you have a chance in a local referendum. That would give you the ultimate say. But the most important thing I think that's been said this evening so far, notwithstanding the young lady's kick at UKIP, is Nicola saying that SNP MPs would next year vote for full fiscal autonomy. I wouldn't. Look, Nicola's own financial advisers have said that this is a bad deal for Scotland and leaves a black hole. Scottish business leaders say it would leave a black hole. More importantly, arguably, Scottish trade union leaders have said it would be bad for our economy. So I won't be siding with Nicola's party because I want to keep the Barnett formula. The Barnett formula is fair for Scotland. I want to keep the Barnett formula today, tomorrow and forever. And that's what you get with Labour.
OK, I'll come to you. Yeah. You know, I feel that sometimes we hear Barnett formulas and full fiscal autonomy. The Barnett formula is the mechanism by which Scottish spending is decided at the moment. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, you know, the whole point of having more control over your economy and your decisions over tax, and remember, having that control is also about having control over employment matters, the minimum wage, the things that help us to get people into jobs and lift people out of poverty. The whole point of that is that you don't accept that you're in deficit forever. You don't accept the inevitability of further Westminster cuts. You take control to try to grow your economy and get your finances into much better shape. The alternative to that is to accept that we will be at the mercy of continued Westminster cuts. Now, I don't think that's the right option for Scotland. Instead, I think we should move to having more control over our own affairs. That's
Nicola,
what I will continue to argue.
You had the chance to have these votes in the Scottish Parliament. And when you had the vote in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP voted not to ban the exploitative zero-hours contracts. They voted not to move on the living wage. And you voted
the
also,
Scottish
Nicola.
Government doesn't
Nicola, you've
employ
had more than
anybody on
enough
0 hours
say.
contracts.
When it came to a
The
vote on
Westminster
those
Government
people
can't say
on
the
the
same.
welfare fund, now these are some of the most vulnerable people in our country in the welfare fund. Labour said, let's give them cash payments. The SNP sided with the Tories to give them vouchers.
We set up
so those
the welfare
those
fund.
people on that welfare fund, when they go for their shopping, they stand in the queue next to you.
That's rubbish.
And embarrassingly, they hand over vouchers for their food. That's a humiliation.
That's not, Jim,
and Nicola, that's your fault
you're
and your
actually,
responsibility.
You're using,
and you should be ashamed of yourself for doing that.
You're shamefully using vulnerable people to make a political point there. We set up the welfare fund. We spend £100 million a year mitigating Tory welfare cuts. You stood in the way of devolving welfare powers to the Scottish Parliament. If we were in control of welfare powers, we wouldn't have to mitigate Tory cuts. We could set a decent welfare system for our own so that we could lift these people out of poverty.
Talking about your mistakes isn't about demonising the poor.
Why don't
Making
you
those
let us
people on
take
the
these
welfare
decisions
fund
ourselves?
have to rely on vouchers for their food.
That's
That's what's unfair for those vulnerable people. Not me reminding you of your record, Nicola.
I don't want to live in a Scotland. I don't want to live in a Scotland where we're having to set up a welfare fund to mitigate against Tory welfare cuts.
Absolutely.
I want us to have the ability in our own hands to have a decent social security system so that we have a decent safety net so that we can lift people out of poverty and people don't have to be relying on a welfare fund at all. That's the kind of Scotland I want to live in.
We've heard a lot from the two people beside me. Ruth Davidson.
You have to be able to fund welfare, and full fiscal autonomy right now, if you voted for it next year, would mean that we had billions of pounds less in Scotland to spend on welfare. In fact, the IFS says it would be £7.6 billion, which is more than we spend on every single pensioner in this country. And that's the other half of the equation, Nicola, that you don't want the people out there to know. It would cost us billions.
I'm sorry, we've heard a lot. I'm sorry, we cannot just stick to the two people in the middle because we have a panel of 6.
I think what Nicola needs to accept is that she lost the referendum last year and she needs to revisit in this argument. And also what we need is to recognise that we have got many more powers coming to the Scottish Parliament, thanks to the vow that we made, and we are going to deliver on that.
OK, I'm going to take another question because I think this is where the debate will roll on. Very quickly, one sentence.
The one thing Nicola does not tell you about is that she wanted to be part of Europe and out of the UK and into the European Union. Quite frankly, the decisions, 70% of decisions are made in Europe, in Brussels, not here in Scotland, not here in Westminster. We need to bring the powers back to this country.
We may come to that. And we may come to that, but for now let's take another question. And the next question is from Alistair Thompson. Mr Thompson.
What policy position of yours is beyond compromise?
Right. What policy position of yours is beyond compromise? The polls suggest that this general election could be heading for a dead heat. This party, the Scottish National Party, may hold the balance of power. Maybe the Liberal Democrats, it may be the UKIP, it may indeed be the Greens. So who knows? It could be anyone who could have a role in this, in our new politics. I suppose is that the thrust of your point? Exactly. Right. So what policy position of yours is beyond compromise? Patrick Harvey.
Well, I could never support a government that was supporting the idea of replacing our weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde. I would never support a government that was willing to repeat the disastrously failed neoliberal economic model, which has allowed wealth to be hoarded by those who need it the least, while those who are in greatest need are left stranded. But I think there's an interesting question about the kind of politics that could emerge out of this. I think this country has a genuine, honest-to-goodness, multi-party democracy that is struggling to find its way out from under the first-past-the-post system. First-past-the-post is great at choosing between two things. Choosing, as Jim says, between which guy's going to walk into number 10. I think we need a system which allows people that broader range of choices across the political spectrum and it places an expectation on all political parties that they'll behave maturely and that they'll find areas of genuine common ground. Coalition doesn't need to be as dishonest as the current one at UK level is, where one party went round half the country in 2010 saying, vote for us, we're the only way to keep the Tories out, and the other half the country saying, vote for us, we're the only way to get rid of Gordon Brown, and the leader in the middle said, we've ruled nothing in and we've have ruled nothing out. It doesn't have to be
But
that
Patrick
way.
Harvey, can I just
Most
check
European
something?
countries have a genuine
Harvey.
multi-party democracy. I think this country deserves
Sure.
one too.
Can I just check something with you? So, are you effectively saying that the Green Party will not in any way prop up a government or support a government that is in favour of capitalism?
I think there genuinely needs to be a re-evaluation of the nature of economic
But is that
power.
a red line for you in this general election if the Green Party MPs might be called upon, who knows, to have a say? Are you basically saying you won't be involved in any government if capitalism is the model that they are proceeding with?
There is a fundamental problem with the nature of modern capitalism as it stands at the moment. Finance capitalism, where so much of our economy
your point about
is
that, but
owned
what's the answer to the
by
question
the finance industry.
I understand
we talked
that.
a moment
What's the
ago.
answer to your question, though, to my question about government and whether or not you would support a government? Because who knows, your MPs might be called upon to do so.
Is that word a red line? I'm not sure that would be meaningful. Look, in the last session of the Scottish Parliament, which was balanced, we found genuine areas of common ground to work together with a minority government, even though we have serious areas of differences as well. And I think that's the mature way to go about it.
Okay.
The phrase a moment ago was control over our own economy. Let's remember that so much control over our real economy, infrastructure, the railways, the energy industry has been handed over to a tiny number of vast multinationals.
Okay, thank you
That's
very
the
much.
kind of control that we need to get back so that our economy itself is democratically accountable.
Thank you very much. Willie Rennie.
On cue, Europe again.
The question was, what policy position of yours is beyond compromise?
Yeah, we've sought to do in the last 5 years is to get the economy back on track and do it fairly. Now, we think we've made progress on that. Now, what we need to do next is to continue that progress. So there's a range of policies that we've set out in terms of cutting the deficit, balancing the books and doing it fairly, investing in the NHS, £800 million, investing in school education from cradle right through to college, delivering more powers to the Scottish Parliament. Those are our top priorities.
No, but
along
the
with
question's
5
not top
green laws.
priorities. The question is beyond compromise.
But what the issue is here is that it's up to the voters to decide the strength that they give each political party. You cannot demand beyond your strength.
Would you have said
It's up to the
tuition
voters.
fees was beyond compromise, for example?
James, you know I've said sorry for that, Nick Clegg said sorry for that, but what we need to do is to make sure that in the next Parliament we deliver that stable government for the future of the country to stay on the course that we've pursued in the last 5 years.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, I was asked for a single policy that's beyond compromise, and I'll tell you that absolutely straight. I will not compromise our commitment to the United Kingdom. We are the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party.
It's not a great surprise, I must say. Not a great surprise. I mean, what practical effect does that have?
Well, first of all, that means that we won't be doing any sorts of deals with the SNP, and to be fair to Nicola, she's ruled out doing any sort of deal with us, so people at home can be assured when they're looking down their ballot paper that we won't be letting the SNP by backdoor into government, because we don't believe that you want to do a coalition deal. You want to put at the heart of the UK government a party whose sole aim is to break up the UK. And what we've also said is that we will continue to fight, because yes, the referendum happened. We were told that we weren't going to be having another one for a political generation. That slightly got washed away last night.
Would you block
so we
one?
think
Would you block one? The Prime Minister says this evening, we settled that on the question of a referendum. Would you prevent one being held again?
Well, I think this is really a question for Nicola, because she didn't ask it last night. Would she seek one?
It's not. It's a question for you. We'll come to questions. Ms Sturgeon will be asked plenty. This one's for you. Would you block... I mean, the point is that Westminster has, in a certain sense, or had last time, to acquiesce to allow the constitutional arrangements to be put in place. Would your party block that, if this is a red line for you, as you say it is?
We did not block it. I do not...
No, will you?
I do not see an area where, if the circumstances arose again, that we would. However, we were promised, and we would feel the betrayal very deeply, when we were promised time after time after time by Nicola, by Alex Salmond, by John Swinney, by all of her MSPs, all her MPs, all her MEPs, all her councillors, that this was, and I quote the SNP poster, their one opportunity. When we were told it was once in a generation, we were told by the end of the campaign it was once in a lifetime. If she's coming back next year in her manifesto with this, and that's the question she didn't answer last night, and I would like an answer to it this evening.
What policy position of yours is going to compromise?
I'm not planning or proposing another referendum. A vote for the SNP in this election is not a vote for another referendum. It is a vote to make Scotland's voice heard much, much more loudly.
Look, everyone's asking about 2016. Everyone around me.
I haven't even started the process
of
drafting the 2016 manifesto.
You must have.
I've not published. I've not published.
It hasn't crossed your mind.
I've not.
It has not crossed your mind.
Let me answer the question. I've not published the 2015 manifesto yet, but something material would have to change in terms of the circumstances or public opinion before I think it would be appropriate to have a proposal for a referendum.
Like what?
Well, you know, I don't know. Perhaps if the Tories wanted to drag us out of the European Union against our will, for example, that might change the circumstances. But you know, let me also say why it would be completely outrageous for any one of us to stand in here on this platform tonight and rule out for ever and a day the Scottish people getting the chance to choose. And the reason for that is it's not in the gift of politicians to do that. If we learned anything during the referendum campaign, surely it was that the future of this country, the decisions that determine the direction of this country, don't belong to politicians, they belong to the people of Scotland.
Briefly, Mr Rennie, briefly.
You're not thinking about breaking your promise, are you? Because I would advise against it.
I'm sure you would. I'm not. I think, unlike the Liberal Democrats, we'll keep keeping our promises.
Are you inclined towards it?
There's a basic. I do accept the result of the referendum, but there's a.
Like the European Union will keep on voting.
There is a triple lock.
We may yet come to that.
You know,
Mr Murphy,
before it's inserted in a manifesto, something has to change. Then people have to vote for the manifesto if it is in it, and then people have to vote for independence. Politicians don't dictate this. The people are in charge. That's the basic issue of democracy.
Nicola, you don't get a mandate from an opinion poll. You get a mandate in your manifesto. And you've gone from being the proud co-leader of the big Yes campaign to being the kind of head of the Maybe's Aye, Maybe's No campaign. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing that badge or slogan or placard. But look, folks, this election that we're having isn't a rerun of the referendum.
You make it
people who voted all sorts of different ways in last year's referendum will vote all sorts of different ways in this general election.
Do you remember the question?
Of course, one thing I won't compromise on. First of all, sir, I won't compromise on my determination that Labour wins a majority government. But on the policy, we will never compromise on the fact that people who do the right thing and go out to work should be treated properly. So we'll increase the minimum wage, we'll abolish the exploitative zero-hours contracts, we'll end the need for food banks. People who go to work should always be better off than they would otherwise be on benefit, and on that Labour won't compromise.
So there's three policies. Increase the minimum wage, 0 hours contracts you're going to crack down on, and you'll get rid of food banks?
Get rid of the need for food banks.
Get rid of the need for food banks. So they're the three you won't compromise on. Nicola Sturgeon kindly reminded me in my ear that she didn't answer the question. What policy position of yours is beyond compromise?
We will not vote for further spending cuts in the next Parliament because they're harming the most vulnerable in our society. And secondly, we will never, ever, ever vote for the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile system, because at a time when we are talking about austerity and the impact of austerity, it would be completely and utterly immoral to be spending £100 billion putting new weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde. That money should be invested in the future of our children.
You want to spend that money? Oh, well, Ruth Davidson, yeah, why not? You want to spend that money, don't you?
Can I ask a question? Because I just want this clarified. Because the wording of what Nicola said about Trident has changed over the last few weeks, I've noticed. And it used to be, we're against this, and now it's, we'll never vote for it. And there is a deal that's being worked out right now. We're seeing it half in public, half in private, between Ed Miliband and Nicola Sturgeon about her inviting the Labour Party to let them put Ed Miliband in power. And saying that you won't vote for Trident is not the same as saying that if there's a vote in the House of Commons, your MPs will vote against it. Will your MPs vote against it?
Let me put it very simply.
It's
often asked of me, is Trident a red line? Well, here's my answer. You better believe Trident is a red line.
Rather than abstaining? Is that voting against it rather than abstaining, though?
We will vote against any vote in the House of Commons the renewal of Trident. We won't vote for it, we will vote against it. There is no circumstances in which SNP MPs will support the renewal of Trident. Is that clear enough for you?
That's clear enough for me.
There's a more nuanced point, though, and I'll come to the audience in a sec, but there's a more nuanced point here, isn't there? Because the question is not necessarily whether you would vote against Trident, which you've made clear you would. The question is, if a Labour government depended on SNP votes to continue in power, and you lost that Trident vote from your perspective...
hang on.
Let me finish the question, if you don't mind. The question, therefore, is, would you then bring down that Labour government?
I'm sure you're familiar with the terms of the Fixed Terms Parliament Act. You can beat minority governments in the House of Commons on policy issues, force them to change direction without necessarily bringing down the government.
Yeah, but if they lose a vote of confidence and there's no other government formed in 14 days, then it collapses.
If we could get support in the House of Commons, and I know there'll be a lot of Labour backbenchers who also don't want to see the renewal of Trident, then yes, we could force a different direction, and that would be a very, very good way of Scotland making its voice heard in the next Parliament.
The way to avoid this public horse trading like this is that, of course, we have an election. We have an election on the 7th of May. You can avoid public horse trading, of course you could. But you could have a lot more poverty and people in hardship, of course you could.
We can have a lot more people in work.
The fact is, 7th of May is the election. The media have decided the most important day in the 7th of May of election is the 8th of May. I think you should get the right to decide what happens rather than leaving it to the pundits to do the post-match analysis of an event that hasn't yet taken place. Okay, I'm confident that we can win this election. It's a two-horse race between Labour and the Tories. We're either going to have Ed Miliband or David Cameron as Prime Minister. Any seat the SNP win from Labour here in Scotland increases the chances of David Cameron being the leader of the biggest party. And the leader, the leader of the biggest party has been in government since every election since 1924. We cannot take that risk. We cannot take that gamble. We need to have certainty and change.
There's someone on the panel we haven't heard from, and it's not fair to everybody if we don't. David Coburn.
Well, our red line obviously would be doing
Europe.
Also, Nicola, with people like you, we would be totally against any party who wants to break up the United Kingdom.
That's a relief for me, let me tell you.
For 300 years, Nicola. It served us well for 300 years. They want an unstable currency, and they want to be part of a sclerotic Europe, which is collapsing, with Southern Europe in a financial collapse.
And they
would also have to have the euro, which I don't think anybody here would want.
I can't tell you how relieved I am to hear that I'm irretrievably on the wrong side of David Coburn. I'm delighted about that.
Good. Let's go to the audience. Thank you very much.
We're doing rather well.
Let's go to the lady right in the front in the blue jacket.
Just going back to the original question about what you won't compromise on. Nobody tonight, there's been a lot of talk about the NHS, there's been a lot of talk about welfare and vulnerable people, but nobody, I think, in any of the leaders' debates has focused on the need and the growing need for really good and well-resourced social care services in Scotland and indeed in the UK. And I'd love to see that being something that the politicians won't compromise on.
The woman in the green dress, or in green anyway, up there, yes.
I'm just wondering, Labour say that they won't compromise. If it came to it, would they, if it comes down to it, will they actually join in with us? Will they join in a coalition with SNP?
Okay, thank you very much. Jim Murphy.
I wonder if I can just pick up on two of the points briefly, Jim, that's okay, because
sure.
I've already addressed one of them in part, which is that we want to beat David Cameron at the ballot box, not in a backroom deal. Like in the Grand National's coming up, and there are 40 horses in that race, and most people get a pin out and put a pin in the Daily Record or something to pick the horse. In this election, you put the pencil in your hand and hover over your ballot paper, and it's either a Labour government or a Tory government. We're determined to get rid of David Cameron and his Tories that way rather than through a deal. But the lady here asked about care in the health services. One of the things I think that politicians of all parties should focus more on, and that's the pressure of mental health in our country.
This is an issue devolved to Holyrood, isn't it? Oh, it doesn't really, figure in this general election,
picking up on
does
the
it?
points, I mean, well, it is how you fund it. Look, 1 in 4 Scots experience mental health problems at some point during their lives. We all probably know someone who has been affected, and we need to direct resources, I think, to care for those with mental health. And we should care as much about those who have got a broken or wounded spirit as we do those with a broken bone or broken body in that sense. And I think ending the stigma, investing more, and having that sense of respect for those people with mental health difficulties and challenges, particularly in the workplace, is something we don't talk about often enough in our country.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, I would agree with that, and I think all political parties, as we look to the 2016 election in Scotland, need to be taking the issue of social care as well as the NHS very seriously, but also how it connects to the welfare system, much of which is reserved at the moment and is the subject for this year's election, much of which is also dependent on how we fund all of our public services and the prospect that a future UK government will carry on cutting Scotland's block grant, carry on cutting Scotland's funding for public services, and carry on driving the kind of economic policies which leave so many people stranded and in ever greater need of care in the future. If we don't get this joined up, if we don't recognise that Scotland's not going to be able to invest in those services if we carry on with an austerity agenda from the UK, and if we carry on with a welfare system which has been subverted away from its original purpose. Its original purpose was supposed to embody the idea that as a society we care for one another, we look after one another from cradle to grave. It's now a system that's bullying people into low-paid work and subsidising that low-paid work so that employers don't need to pay what folk need to live with a bit of dignity. So a £10 minimum wage should be a priority for the next UK government.
Thank you. Now, the question originally was what policy position of yours is beyond compromise, and I feel I've been saying to Mr Coburn all along that we would come to his issue of the EU,
Yes.
and you did say that was your key issue.
Well, it's not the only one. It's
sure, but
break up of the United Kingdom.
If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine.
I'd like to talk about it. The problem is that all these people who sit in all these various parliaments are obtaining money by deception, quite frankly, because they are not actually earning their money properly. 70% of all decisions are made in the European Parliament. And quite frankly, I probably have more effect on them than they do. But the trouble is, as an MEP, you can only say yea or nay. All the legislation starts with the Commission, who are unelected. Now, that means that we are being run by an unelected group in Europe. That is simply not on. I want to see all our powers, all the powers of the European Union, brought back to Holyrood and Westminster, and we should be making those decisions, not European Union. Also, a lot of the poverty that you've been talking about, the 0 hours contract, all that sort of stuff, has been created in reaction to them getting rid of our temping.
That is rubbish.
David,
that is rubbish. Rubbish.
Let somebody else have a say.
David,
and I'll tell you something very important. It's also caused by open-door immigration policy. This is something Jim will never discuss.
Okay,
which is depressing wages. This is depressing wages. And that's one of the reasons why you have food banks. It's depressing wages. Right. He will never admit it because they are the party who allowed this.
There we have it, folks. The immigrants are to blame for everything.
No, they're not.
The immigrants are to blame for everything.
It's the government who left an open-door immigration policy. If I were in Eastern Europe, I'd be coming to the UK too.
Stop demonising people who come to this country and made our country richer and made our country more diverse.
Nicola Sturgeon, ladies and gentlemen, we are very short.
Other countries. My family came to this country as immigrants.
Hello,
don't demonise
Mr Murphy, thank you
who came to this country.
Right, okay, come on, people, thank you. That's enough. Nicola Sturgeon.
I think the only depressing thing tonight is the narrow-minded, xenophobic attitude of David Coburn and his UKIP allies. It is absolutely, utterly disgusting. This is the guy who compared one of my colleagues to a convicted terrorist simply because he's a Muslim. You are a disgrace.
Thank you. Ruth Davidson, you have got 10, and I mean 10 seconds.
Yeah, and I support and supported both Humza Yousaf and Nicola Sturgeon in our stance against his bigotry. But one thing I think we can do is I think we can get a better deal out of Europe. I think we can renegotiate, and then I think we ask people what they think. Because the last time we were asked about Europe was 40 years ago. If you're 57 and a half, 58 years old, if you're younger than that, you've never been asked. And unlike Nicola, I believe that referendums about whether to be in or out of a union should come round every generation.
Well, time's up. I'm sorry, lots of people want to come in on the panel, but there's 6 of you and we've run out of time. Thank you very, very much indeed to our panel here, to our audience, thank you, and to you at home for watching as well. There is far more general election information and coverage available on our website, bbc.co.uk/Scotland News. But for now, from us here at the University of Aberdeen, a very good night.